One of the things that really impressed me about transactional analysis when I first learned it was Byrne's radical departure from traditional psychotherapy. His whole emphasis on equality and okayness, that rather than being defective or having some deep pathology, that what really was going on with people is that they learned certain information and made decisions early on that really are affecting how they're interacting in the present. And the early decisions they made were the very best options they had for survival. And they're simply not working for them in the present. And so what they're needing to do is redecide those things. And he also said the measure of a good psychotherapy is the extent to which it reduces the infant mortality rate, which I thought was a really neat way of putting that. In his early teaching seminars, when he would teach psychiatric residents, he would do a group with the residents sitting around the outside watching the people he was working with, the clients, and then at the end, he would have the clients go out and the residents come in and watch, and the clients would then get to observe the residents. So he really, from the very beginning, emphasized the whole issue of equality and putting everybody on an equal footing. And he wanted to develop a language that could be easily understood by an 8-year-old, so the client has just as much access to the tools that they were working with as the professional. So that's one of the things that initially attracted me. I think all of us came from a social justice background where we were concerned about equality in terms of racial and economic justice. So I want to share a little bit with you about the history of transactional analysis, how all of this began with Eric Byrne, who was the developer of TA. He began to develop this information in the late 50s and early 60s. He was a psychiatrist in Carmel, California, who was teaching a seminar there and also in San Francisco. He called these seminars social psychiatry seminars because he said, you don't need to do a lot of archaeology to discover what's going on with people. If you simply observe them closely and are intuitively sensitive to what they are showing you, they will reveal their whole history in the present. He liked to say, to think Martian. If you were a Martian who came down to Earth and you didn't know the language and you just watched people, what would you think was really going on? So he taught people to focus on the psychological level instead of the social level, to look at what implicitly was being expressed rather than what was explicitly being expressed, and really train people to use their intuition. Byrne was born in 1910 in Montreal, Canada. He went to college and medical school at McGill University there. And he came to the U.S. to do his psychiatric residency. While he was beginning his residency, he was in analysis with Paul Federn, who was one of the early ego psychologists, from whom he, I think, initially got the idea of ego states. He was drafted into the military and served for several years as an Army psychiatrist. One of his duties towards the end of his tour as an Army psychiatrist was evaluating soldiers for mental health status when they were ready to be discharged. And it was a very boring job. He was processing hundreds of soldiers a day. So one of the ways he entertained himself was to see how much he could discover about what was going on with people and how much he could learn about people before he ever talked to them. And so as these guys were just standing in line, he could usually deduce where they were from, what their occupation was, whether they were married or not, and all kinds of things simply by using his intuition. And he wrote a series of 5 papers on the nature of intuition that were later published by Paul McCormick in a little monograph called Intuition and Ego States. It's really a fascinating read about how he began to develop a lot of his ideas just from playing around with his own intuition. In 1958, well, at the end of his tour in the Army, he was discharged at Fort Ord, California, and decided to stay in that area. He lived in Carmel, California, and was traveling to San Francisco to consult at the Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute there, and began setting up seminars to teach people about TA. He initially, he went into analysis again after he finished his tour to finish up his analysis with Erik Erikson, who wrote the book Childhood and Society. And it was probably from Erikson that he got a lot of his ideas about life scripts. When he finished his analysis, he applied for admission to the Psychoanalytic Institute in San Francisco. And for whatever reason, nobody really knows, he initially was turned down. Most people speculate it was because he was somewhat non-traditional and was doing things that were not considered appropriate for orthodox analysts, like getting married and things like that, while he was in analysis. But for whatever reason, he was initially turned down. And he decided he didn't need psychoanalysis. He would develop his own model. And within about a 2-year period, he developed about 90% of the theory of transactional analysis, which was really an incredible achievement. He was a very bright man. He had an IQ of about 180. He was really in the genius category. And he had the incredible ability to take very complex ideas and express them in very simple language. Which made his theories very popular because they caught on very quickly. The simple language that he used was misunderstood by some of the more traditional professionals and kind of saw this as pop psychology and wanted to dismiss it. But if you really read his early work, even though the language is very simple, the concepts are really profound. And I'm amazed every time I go back and read his work, what an incredible genius he was to be able to express such complex ideas in such simple language, just everyday, ordinary English language. In 1958, he began the San Francisco Social Psychiatry Seminar in San Francisco. His ideas caught on very quickly. And in 1962, he and his students began publishing what was called the TA Bulletin, which was kind of a record of what they were discovering in these seminars. In 1964, there were people coming from all over the US, as well as several foreign countries, to study at his seminar. And so he and his students formed the International Transactional Analysis Association, which now has associations in almost every major country worldwide. I think we have over 20 countries represented in this conference. And it makes the conferences really exciting because you get to hear and learn from people all over the world who are using a common language, theoretical language, in terms of TA. In 1970, Byrne died of a massive heart attack, which was very unfortunate, and the TA Bulletin was changed to the TA Journal in his name. Byrne was a contemporary of Albert Ellis, and I think if he had lived as long as Ellis lived, TA would be in a much different standing in the world today. It's really a shame he didn't get to live longer. But fortunately, his students really picked up where he left off and have continued to develop the theory. There is lots of new theory coming out of various countries around the world, many new books being published in Europe and especially in the UK, in the United Kingdom. So I'm going to give you some of the books, but there are many more that are coming out. They're being published so fast it's almost difficult to keep up with them these days. But TA is much bigger currently other places in the world than it is in the U.S. It's kind of been assimilated by all the different theories, especially in the addictions field, but many other fields. People have really borrowed from TA and called it other things. And people use the concepts and language all the time, and some of them don't even know where it came from. Internal family systems theory is one example. It's basically transactional analysis with different labels. And it's amazing how little credit people have given to Byrne and his work. It's really sad. I want to talk briefly about some of the people who influenced Byrne. The first is Paul Federn, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the first ego psychologists. And Federn was one of the first people to identify that in our current personality, we have archaic, earlier parts of our personality that are activated, or what is traditionally called cathected, energized, when we encounter some stimulus in the present that's like something we experienced in early childhood. For example, I might go into the boss to ask for a raise, and suddenly I feel like I'm 4 years old asking my father for an allowance and feeling all the anxiety and other feelings that I felt as a little kid. So that frequently will occur. We often regress spontaneously when we experience some stimulus in the present that's like some earlier experience in childhood. Federn's student, Eduardo Weiss, wrote a lot about Federn's work, and I think, again, was a heavily influence on Byrne's development of the whole concept of ego states. Erik Erikson, that I mentioned earlier, who wrote Childhood and Society, the 8 Psychosocial Stages in Human Development, talked about the overall life course that people go through and their development psychologically. And I think that's probably where Byrne got some of his ideas about life's grips. Another person I think that really influenced Byrne heavily in the beginning was Wilder Penfield, who was a neurosurgeon doing research on the cause of focal epilepsy, which is people having seizures in response to certain light patterns. So he was drilling holes in the skull and inserting electrodes, stimulating different parts of the brain to locate what part of the brain was responsible for what activity. And interestingly enough, he never really discovered the locus of focal epilepsy. But he did discover some very interesting things. What he found was that when certain parts of the brain are stimulated, people recall the experience with as much intensity as they experienced originally in the first occurrence. And they not only see and hear what was said and done, but they feel and experience what was going on in the experience. And at the same time, they have a part of them that can objectively know that this is not the original occurrence, that they are re-experiencing it. So Byrne used Penfield's experiments as a basis for the ego states, as scientific evidence of these phenomena that are occurring in the brain. The other thing that Penfield contributed to the field was he was the first to map the cerebral cortex. So he's the one who was responsible for labeling the different parts of the brain and their function. Another person that I think heavily influenced Byrne was Renee Spitz, who was a psychologist who was studying infants left in orphanages over in Europe. And he was very curious about why in those orphanages certain infants would really thrive and do well, and other infants would fail to thrive and sometimes get sick, and in extreme cases even die. And he thought it must have something to do with the cleanliness of the conditions or something like that. To his amazement, he found that the primary factor that made the difference was in orphanages where infants really thrived and did well. There were very loving, nurturing caretakers who would pick these infants up, play with them, handle them, stimulate them, talk to them. Whereas in the orphanages where infants did not do well, they were fed and their diapers were changed, but little else. And Byrne began to realize how important stimulation is, what he calls stroking, to our survival early on. We are one of the few mammals who are born without a completed nervous system. And so the nervous system actually gets completed by the handling, the talking, the interacting with the child by the parents. I think Alfred Adler is another person who probably heavily influenced Byrne's ideas of life scripts, although Byrne doesn't talk a lot about Adler and to what extent he influenced Byrne's ideas about life scripts. But Adler is one of the few people in psychology who talk about a phenomena that's very similar to life scripts, which he called the life plan. And he basically said it's a way that in childhood we try to overcome our feelings of inferiority. Byrne talked about the script as a basic survival plan, a plan we developed very early in order to learn how to survive psychologically and emotionally in the family that we grow up in, which we then extend to the broader world. Another person who was a heavily influence on Byrne was Wilfred Bion, who was a British analyst who was the first to study behavior in groups and developed a lot of information on group psychotherapy. And Byrne draws heavily from Bion in his own work on group, what he called group treatment. And then, of course, Sigmund Freud. Almost everybody today in psychology or in psychotherapy is indebted to Freud's initial ideas. And Byrne was trained as an analyst, and life script theory was one of the last parts of the theory to be developed. So Byrne initially would put people into groups, get them into a position of experiencing themselves as okay by understanding their ego states, their transactions with other people, the rackets and games that they might enter into. And then he would put them into psychoanalysis to resolve the early trauma that they had experienced. Once he developed life script theory, he no longer used psychoanalysis and used life script theory instead.